Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Good to see you all. Let's come to order, please. I'm Martin Jean. I'm director of the Institute of Sacred Music. Great pleasure to welcome you here to this symposium, Echoes Through Time. Special thanks, of course, to our convener, Elliot Canfield, and ISM staff, Evan Graves and Katya, and all the Sachin and so many others who put this event together. I'm just here to, in addition to saying hello, to give you a little bit of backdrop as to why in the world we would do such a gathering as this. First to say that we're now in our 52nd year of the Institute, and this place was founded in a sense to study and develop practices around sacred music, worship or ritual, and all the related arts thereunto. And with a particular focus on kind of religious communities per se, but also spilling out into the public world as it does. This sort of sacred sensorium is our main stock and trade, and it is that simply because of our interest in different kinds of religious or spiritual or cosmological practices. The Institute is founded with a very broad indenture, in fact, that does not limit us to any one religion, although we are partnered with Yale Divinity School, which is a ecumenical Christian divinity school. Yale School of Music is one of our major partners, a conservatory type of institution. We, in fact, have within our purview the opportunity to support and engage with all so-called religious traditions of any time and place, anywhere on the planet or anywhere out there in the stars. So when you discover a house of prayer on Mars, you let us know, and we'll try to be there, probably in one of Musk's spaceships. So a number of years ago, the ISM faculty had a kind of strategy meeting thinking about how we best deploy this multivalent, religious, multidisciplinary mission to best use. And we wanted to do things that would engage all of those things, deal with various kinds of sensorial practices and spiritual traditions. And in addition to a number of other things that we've got going here, initiative in ecology and religion and so on, it seemed logical and like low-hanging fruit to think about the built and natural environment as it relates to spiritual practices. And I guess that's why we're here. Elliot is our first postdoc in this regard, first of many, I hope, that is helping to guide our sort of initial steps in this way. And we're particularly kind of chuffed that we can interact with so-called hard sciences as well as social sciences and humanities and the arts, of course. So unfortunately, I can't stay with you very long because I've got a gig this weekend. So I'm headed to the airport, but I'll also look forward to hearing reviews and notes and any recordings made of your engagements here, and very much thanks to all of you for making the trek here. I know that's an expensive proposition in terms of time and resources. So thank you and very welcome. And here's Elliot.
Thank you all for joining us for this symposium. Sound has the ability to transcend the ordinary and create profound experiences, foster deep connections with the divine, each other, and oneself. This interdisciplinary and transcultural symposium on sacred space acoustics invites acousticians, historians, and artists to explore how sound and acoustics shape our interactions within sacred and heritage sites. I'm so thrilled to be joined by 14 scholars who all conduct interdisciplinary research on topics that relate to sound, architecture, and perception. Over the next 2 days, we're going to hear from architects, acousticians, musicologists, engineers, artists, musicians, archaeologists, I did it on there twice, all discussing topics related to sound and sacred cultural heritage spaces. We'll hear presentations on topics related to speech intelligibility, historic performance practice, spirituality, soundscapes, auditory awe, immersive virtual reality, and so much more, enriching our understanding of cultural identity, spiritual and religious expression, sound propagation in religious spaces, and the human experience. In addition to the presentations, I'm personally looking forward to the conversations and discourse that will emerge from these inspiring talks. Before we get started with the first session, I'd like to take a minute to say farewell to Jonathan Stern and Angelo Farina, two giants in our field who passed away recently. Jonathan Stern was a professor of culture and technology at McGill University. Stern's scholarship concerned the cultural dimensions of communication technologies. He was the author of seminal books, including The Audible Past, Cultural Origins of Sound Reproduction, MP3, The Meaning of a Format, and Diminished Faculties, as well as numerous articles. Angelo Farina was a professor of physics and acoustics at the University of Parma and was a pioneer in numerous areas of research, particularly in the field of applied acoustics. He's the author of over 300 scientific publications on topics related to room acoustics, measurement, and modeling. And in 2024, he was awarded the Silver Medal by the Audio Engineering Society as a testament to the significance of his scientific contributions. So Angelo and Jonathan will be sorely missed by their students, colleagues, families, and the greater research community. This symposium is going to consist of 4 main sessions, 2 today and 2 tomorrow. The talks are scheduled on 30-minute intervals, which should allow some time for questions and discussion following each talk. For questions, I ask that we please use the handheld microphone so that people who are following on the live stream are able to hear the questions in addition to the answers. And finally, you can find the full symposium schedule, including all of the extended bios and abstracts for the presenters and the talks online. There's a QR code posted at the door, so you can scan that, or you can find it through the website. So thank you so much for joining us. And I'm going to start this first session, and I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who is Dr. Chris Kyriakakis. He's a professor of engineering at the University of Southern California, where he teaches and conducts research at the intersection of audio signal processing, acoustics, and psychoacoustics at the Viterbi School of Engineering. His work is driven by a passion for interdisciplinary collaboration, and he's authored more than 100 technical papers, a textbook on immersive audio, and holds more than 20 patents. So I'm going to turn the screen on and invite Chris to get set up.
Now let's hope it works.
Let's hope it works. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yay. It even remembered the settings. Hello, everyone. First of all, please notice I went to extra lengths to find this font. just please remember that. So Thessaloniki is a special place for me. I was born there. Oh, do we need this? I was projecting. Oh, we do. Oh, I better be careful. I was born and raised in Thessaloniki before moving to Los Angeles many years ago. So when the opportunity came to do a research project there, it was one that I jumped on immediately. We have one member of our team here, Professor Donahue from Berklee College of Music. You can see the rest of the team there in one of the smallest spaces that we could fit everyone in and still make it acoustically interesting. Professor Gerstel from UCLA is a colleague that co-leads this project from the Byzantine art and archaeology perspective. We have musicologists, archaeologists. It's very interdisciplinary. And also, as we went through, a number of cantors, you may recognize one name there, some of the Perhaps older members of ISM, Dr. Nectarios Antoniou, I guess, walked these halls some years ago. I'm not sure of the exact timing, but he was very involved, and you will see his face and hear his voice shortly. So let's talk about this. There's, I guess, the research question that we wanted to ask and answer, which we know can't be answered, was, did the architectural change, the style change in Byzantine churches that went from kind of these Roman style buildings to more domed ones, which occurred, depending on who you talk to, around between the 6th and 8th century, also coincided with a change in the musical style of chanting. And the chicken and egg problem is, of course, which one came first, and then did one influence the other? We tried to gather some data around that question, and there's a lot of debate still. But the first thing I wanted to tell you, okay, so Thessaloniki is here. It was the second largest city in the Byzantium, not far from Constantinople. I guess being Greek, we are contractually required to still call it Constantinople, even though it's been 700 years since it changed name, but that's okay. One of the things we wanted to hear to demonstrate is how can you, are they really that acoustically different? So after some work of searching, finding an example of an anechoic chant recording, so something like this. And then allowing the church itself to perform the convolution of the reverb, but just by playing it back over a loudspeaker in the church and recording it. Rather dramatically different than this small space. So we wanted to quantify these differences. These churches range from the 5th century to the 14th century. I was talking earlier, I would love to have a slider that has centuries on the bottom and just change centuries and change perspectives. So today I'm talking about some topics that relate to this. It turns out, as with everything we do with sound, there are preferences. You can do, and I tell my students this, you can do all the science in the world, but there is no equation for the good sound. How do you solve that? In the end, it's humans that have to listen to it, and they have preferences. We're going to talk about spaces that were created for singing and for speaking, and some of them were different, and they knew about it. How? Also, location. Inside a specific space, they would move to different places, and we have historical record of that, to chant different parts of the liturgy, some of it driven by the iconography, but some of it also driven by the acoustics, perhaps together. And in the end, a topic that makes my engineering colleagues very uncomfortable when I talk about it, but I will talk about it anyway, hearing voices, and very specific voices, and we will see what that means. Speaking of Angelo Farina, we used his signal, and in his honor, I'm going to play it. Sweeps, this is how we did the experiments. We got permissions, we put loudspeakers, we play sweeps, and we model these churches as what we call in electrical engineering and signal processing linear time invariant systems. They are linear. If you double the volume, it plays twice as loud. If time invariant means if you do the experiment now or tomorrow, you'll get the same answer. And of course, the time here is, in some cases, was 1,500 years, which is kind of cool to talk about. And then, of course, even in the class that I teach, we say all the acoustical information is contained in the impulse response. That ignores many, many things, and it's nice on paper, but we found lots of surprises. So in honor of Angelo, here's the lengths we went to. We found that chanters actually face the front, and they have their backs during certain parts of the liturgy to the audience. I can't go a day without playing a sign sweep, so I'm going to play it anyway. It just puts me in the mood for feeling good. Some people find this objectionable. I don't know why. It's so pleasant. We'll talk about this towards the end as well, so I just wanted everybody to hear it all the way up to 20 kilohertz. Good speakers. We also, besides the facing of the chanters, we also want to take into account the fact that the directivity of human voice is not omnidirectional. There are many papers on this. This is a more recent one that showed that basically if you're facing the front and you're speaking vowels or consonants, most of the energy, and it changes with frequency, but most of the energy, of course, goes towards the front, and this is looking from the side. It's actually biased a little bit towards the height, towards the upper direction. So it turns out that horn-loaded loudspeakers have very similar type of directivity, especially at high frequencies, so that was one of the reasons we used those. A lot of people who do measurements for reverberation only try to use omnidirectional speakers, but we were, of course, very interested in trying to do this to match the voice. So let's listen to some examples. Here's Dr. Nectarios. I'm going to flip through a couple of churches just so you can hear. We had him very involved. He sang in it, so we didn't want to just play the anechoic recording, but we had him sing the same chant in different churches and recorded it, and that gives us a very nice perspective of how it sounds in different places. So here he is in one of the small churches.
Άγγελος πρωτοστάτης ουρανόθεν επέμφθη, υπήν τη Θεοτόκο το κέρε.
When we took him to the bigger church, one of the bigger churches,
Άγγελος πρωτοστάτης ουρανόθεν επέμφθη, υπήν τη Θεοτόκο το κέρε.
don't have to speak Greek to understand. He was stretching his words. He was enthralled by the reverberation, and that style, that changing, is called the callophonia, or colophony, I guess, in English. And in a church that's in between those two in size, he did an in-between.
Άγγελος πρωτοστάτης ουρανόθεν επέμφθη, υπήν τη Θεοτόκο. Άγγελος πρωτοστάτης ουρανόθεν επέμφθη.
And he noticed it. We actually have him on video talking about it. He's not an acoustics expert, but he spoke English better than some of the other chanters, so but they talked about it.
The space is enhancing the chanting, and due to the reverberation, the volume that I use here is louder if I was singing with the same volume, I believe, in St. Nicholas Orphanos, because of the unresponsive, to say, space. I wouldn't be using the same volume, I wouldn't have the same return, and I would feel more exhausted in that space using this type of volume.
So I think we can assume that he represents people who sang in these spaces over the centuries. I'm sure they're experiencing similar things. So what clues can we search for? One is, of course, reverberation time. And we can see here for all of our churches, this is the reverberation time in seconds as a function of frequency, and we range down here from under 1 second. That was that first church that I played you, all the way to the bigger church, the 5th century Achiropitos church that has close to 3 seconds, and everything else in between. They exhibit some classic symptoms: high frequency roll off, because it's much easier to absorb high frequencies than it is low frequencies, and depending on the materials. This one has a wooden roof, so there is some absorption from there. But this information is just, it's not enough to explain everything. So we had to dig deeper into the data to understand. One of the things that we found is this notion of preference. So this is Prophetis Elias, Prophet Elias in the 14th century church, domed. And we heard about a phenomenon in here that we wanted to investigate. So you walk into the church, here's Professor Donahue and I in our archaeoacoustics gear. And we're told that behind a door, if you go up this dark corridor, up the steps, there's this secret balcony. I made Jim go up first. It looked very dangerous. But when we got there, and you could look down, there was historical record that an archbishop, that when he visited the city, I think in the 12th century, always demanded that he sit up there. That wasn't the normal place to sit, but he preferred the sound in this particular church sitting up there. So what does it sound like if you record? You're singing on the floor, so we're listening
ουρανόθεν επέφθη, υπήρχε άγγελος πρωτοστάτης, ουρανόθεν επέφθη.
So why is that? If we look at the frequency response, they're pretty similar. Yes, the balcony diminishes the low frequencies, probably because of the cavity, and so diminishing of low frequencies, but they're too low for voice. It just improves our perception of the higher frequencies, but it's not enough. There's an acoustical measure called clarity, or C80, which says if I take the acoustic energy in the first 80 milliseconds, which happens to be a window of perception of the human brain, measure it up, and then divide it by anything past 80 seconds, the tail, that ratio, the higher that ratio is, the more clarity we have, and that means the more intelligibility, which makes sense. A lot of early sound should increase clarity, a lot of reverberation, tail, should decrease it. So if we look at the clarity comparison of the impulse responses, calculated from the impulse responses, it's pretty clear. The balcony, especially in the range of voice, has 2 or 3 decibels higher clarity, and I'll show you in a minute. That's perceptible. Why that is, if we look at the reflection patterns, it's called the energy time curve. So if you take the impulse response and square it, so you have energy, there are no negative values, and you look at it as a function of time, here's the direct sound, obviously the biggest one, and then you can see the purple reflections are coming later in time. The balcony has quite a different pattern. I've time aligned these so they start at the same time, but you can see there's the first and the very strong second reflection, and those early reflections have been tied to perception, increased intelligibility, especially of voice. More recently, I've been trying to analyze this data because it's kind of busy looking at this. There is a metric called the Kepstrom. The Kepstrom is electrical engineers playing with words. The spectrum is what you get when you take a signal and you look at the frequency response. The Kepstrom is when you take how often those frequencies in the frequency response happen, and so they took the word spectrum. And so you go back to the time domain if you take another Fourier transform, basically. And when you do that, it really shows that much more clearly the repetitive reflection, the things that are happening repetitively, which are reflections. So if we look at the nave, there's stuff early on, but not very much happening here. This is probably stuff that's coming from the dome. In the balcony, you have very strong, prominent reflections. No dome, because it doesn't see the dome. So this is another clue. Those early reflections were really affecting. So the Archbishop had good ears. In traditional kind of ISO metrics, the early decay time is almost the same. That's how fast sound decays in the first few milliseconds. The reverberation time is almost the same. But the clarity, this is a musical clarity and this is a voice clarity, slightly different measures, are about 2 decibels down here lower than they are here. And so clearly something was happening. So that's a preference. There's another preference that we wanted to point out. This is the smallest church. It's called Sotiraki. The ending aki in Greek means something is small. Sotiras is the Savior. So this is the official name is Transfiguration of the Savior, or Metamorphosis to Sotiros. But this is the small version of that. So it's tiny. Behind it, under that tent, if you ever visit the city, let me know. I'll tell you, it's one of the best restaurants in the city. And because we wanted to take measurements, this is a living city with buses, not 100 meters away. We wanted to be during a period where it's quiet. And thankfully, in Greece, they still have siesta time. So during that time, we would have an early lunch, and while they were sleeping, the noise goes down, and we can take better measurements. So here we are discussing acoustic measurements right behind the church. There may have been some beverages involved. And then we go into the church, which has a very unusual shape. It is tiny. It is in the shape of a cross, but not very big. It's probably smaller than this room, but with apses all around and a big dome, which we will visit shortly. Our cantors in this church started singing.
Άγγελος πρωτοστάτης ουρανόθεν επέμφθη, Υπήρ Θεοτόκο το χαίρε.
When Jim Donahue and I heard this, we had already recorded some of the other churches, we said, wow, this doesn't sound very good. It sounds, there's a resonance in the voice, and it sounds kind of tubby is the official term. The cantors thought it was the best one. And there is work by Ando over the years that basically says if you're in the audience, the preferred, and you do the experiment of where should the reflections come after the direct sound, the preferred directions is 55 to 60 degrees for the audience. But in that same work, he found that the reflections for the performers that are preferred highly are 180 degrees, which makes sense because it's amplifying their voice, the wall behind them. And that curved surface, which produces this reflection, like a focusing effect, it's actually a stronger reflection than the original direct sound, for sure had something to do with that. So that was a recent finding. How do we explain preference with acoustic measurements? There was another topic that we found. Voice and singing were performed sometimes in different spaces. So here's one of them that we looked at, Hiropitos Church, circa 500. One of my students asked, is that AD? Yes, that is AD. It is very well preserved, other than the roof tiles, of course, which are on the outside. We can find very interesting things. When you walked into this church from the narthex, this is the narthex area here. There's these three arches, which are called the trivelon. That means three curtains, basically, three veils. And having taken impulse responses, we can do very simple, I'm not talking about ray tracing, just very simple acoustical modeling of things that they were doing that we know historically there. So when you walked in, there were curtains here. And here they are. They all have the Adobe logo. I don't know why that is. But you can simulate. The point was, because this was also a visual experience, when you walk in, something mysterious was happening behind there, but you weren't exposed to it yet until you walked all the way through. So we could simulate velour curtain effects on singing inside. And of course, sound played a big role in the experience. Something changed and more glorious happened. This is the Hiropitos Church. The one I want to compare it to is the Hagia Sophia Church. This is modeled on Hagia Sophia. It's a scale model of the very much larger Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. It's in the middle of the busy city. It has a very similar type of dome structure. This is a 7th century church. This is the plan. You can see there's this magnificent dome in the middle, but also smaller domes to the sides. And this church was known historically for having children's choirs with very high-pitched voices. And that was interesting. So, of course, we had to record a children's choir, and we brought them in. Paraphrase one of the recent lines that I heard in a show on Netflix. Say what you want about the Byzantines, but they could write a tune. I'll tell you the original after. So why is it? Why does this church was specifically known for singing, while the other was specifically known for homilies? They would, if you needed to hear what the priest had to say, they had to be in the other church. Well, let's listen to the impulse responses. They're supposed to reveal secrets. Here's the one on the left with the non-domed roof. And the one on the right with the big dome. Kind of the same. So where are these secrets? Well, what happens if you slow down the impulse responses? So this is, I think, 8x. I slowed them down by 8x. Left. Decays very naturally. But listen to what happens to the second one, to the one on the right. You can hear the reflections. Okay, that's interesting. Back to our Kepstrom friend. Here's a model of that second church with the dome. If the microphone was here, sorry, the sound source and microphone were here. So the reflection, the prominent things that are happening besides the floor, which is early on, are of course the dome and the apse behind the hieron, as it's called, big curved surface. So if you look in the large church where they spoke, no, other than the early energy, there's nothing happening. If you look in this, there are very prominent reflections. This is the dome, which is further away, exactly at the distance that we know from the measurement, and this is the apse. Very, very, very clear reflections. The procedure was they would start here. This is the plan of the city. It's only a 5-minute walk. You would start here, singing and chanting. In between C was the Archbishop's house. Sometimes they would actually go outside and sing towards building C, which the remains are only ruins. But then they would walk into Ahiropitos and listen to the priest. So why is that? There are preferences that have been studied, again by Ando and team, for music. People prefer a certain amount of reverberation for vocal music. There are fMRI studies that have been done that show that people prefer a certain amount of reverberation time for music in general. This was for singing, and this was for music. So people knew that they preferred one space for music, clearly. If we look at the reverberation time of the big church, it's higher than this one. So you would expect lower clarity because they're inversely related. But that was the surprise. We actually found that Hagia Sophia, the dome one, actually has clarity that extends all the way out to the high frequencies, children's voices. But whereas the other one has a very narrow kind of a 500 to 3K, 4K boost in clarity, exactly where a voice would be. We were talking about the Epidaurus Theater earlier in our group. The measurements from the Epidaurus Theater have a very similar effect of kind of a megaphone for voice. It's really interesting. How did they know? There's no historic record of acoustic design from the Byzantine times, just observations. Location. Here's another church, Hagia Apostoli, a big fancy dome. And in here, people would sing at different parts of the church doing different things, different chants. So when singing next to this painting of the Magi bringing the gifts to baby Jesus that was just born, much higher clarity than when they sang it in here, which we So the location mattered, and they knew it. They could hear it. Okay, I'm going to finish with just the topic that I love the most, hearing voices. There was a study at Yale, who knew that, about hearing voices that other people don't hear. But I'm talking about very specific voices. You haven't lived until you put this slide up in an engineering department meeting and explain to your colleagues this is your latest research. But there are angel drawings everywhere, and people talked about them at the time, 10th century. It sounds like we're listening to the sound of angels. 12th century. It sounds like we're singing to the accompaniment of angels singing. If we take the farina sweep in a regular room, as it grows in frequency, some of the harmonics occur because of loudspeakers not being perfect. If we take it in a church, we have the same behavior. Here are the harmonics, but something very unusual happened. These things in the background have a pattern, and we didn't know what it was. I've never seen it like this before. In fact, if we remove, and you can do that with an adaptive filter, remove the recording of this and just try to listen to the background, which only happens when the chirp is playing, it looks something like this, these ghostly images. And we heard it. in the church, here's Jim. I was downstairs. Reflections from these elaborate structures as the sweep was playing sounded very, very otherworldly. And I'm going to play you an example of that, what they were. We heard that and were puzzled. Last thing I want to talk about is, in 2 minutes, we brought our chanters into this giant box in Boston. It's the closest we could get to an anechoic chamber because we wanted to test how their voices were being altered by the acoustics. Recorded them like that, and then in addition to the voices of the angels, people in the texts of the time were talking about there is somebody else singing with us in this church. Something is happening. And of course, to an acoustician, that is related to reverberation. There's no other way. Well, there might be other ways, but there's no other way to an acoustician to explain it. So what we did was, because we have the anechoic recording and the impulse responses, it's very hard to hear just the reverberation because, of course, they're singing over it. But if you break it up into syllables and reverberate each one individually, then you can hear what the building itself is doing. So here it is without just original how it was recorded, convolved with the impulse response of this building. What if we take that away and just listen to the building? So I'm stopping after the direct sound of every syllable. Their mouth is closed. That's the equivalent of this experiment. This is just the building. Interesting, right? It's talking to us somehow. Oops. We did this as an experiment at USC. We called it cleverly Byzantium 2.0. We had chanters, and others have done this as well as Stanford and so on, where we tried to recreate this live. So that's my dream. We have so many people here with impulse responses. Why don't we all collect them and make an impulse response museum where people can just travel through centuries of not just church music, any kind of event, and make my dream of a slider come true. Thank you.
Thank you for that talk. Does anybody have any questions? Maybe time for 2 questions or so.
Yeah, that was a really interesting talk. Thank you. I was really interested by the clarity comparisons that you were showing. I was expecting to see a larger difference. I was just wondering, like, in terms, when you were comparing, for instance, clarity and the bishop's favorite secret balcony to the nave, were you controlling it all for, like, the overall distance from source to receiver?
Yes. We time aligned them and level aligned them to, otherwise, although in the end, clarity doesn't matter, but because it's just a ratio. Right. But we did normalize everything so that it is the same. Yes.
Right. I guess the question I have is because clarity is so tied to your physical location. If the measurement location in the nave was 5 meters closer to the source, for instance.
Right. So we have that data. It's just a matter of looking at it. But yes, of course, clarity changes dramatically as you move around, as does reverberation, which is not supposed to, but it does.
Yes.
Yeah. Good question. Thanks.
Thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting. About the same building, I was wondering, given that in my previous research, I noticed you talked about preference. So I measured the emotional impact of acoustic experiences, and I was able to find a link between high resonance quality at frequencies less than 1,000 hertz and positive emotional impact. And I noticed when you compared the two, there were some room modes apparent in the spectrogram. So I was wondering if that could offer additional explanation for the preferred location of the balcony.
It could, yeah. I would love to talk to you more about that.
Yeah.
The frequency. Is it dependent on content as well, or meaning the type of music that it is, or is it just the frequencies?
It's the frequency response. I mean, the type of sound source is important as well. But in general, what I found, there was a correlation between room modes at frequencies less than 1,000 hertz and the preference or the positive emotional impact in worship spaces. So I was just wondering if it could provide an additional explanation for that.
We should talk some more. I'm sure we have
Sure.
data that probably makes that clearer.
Look forward to that.
Time for one more. All right, can we please thank our presenter?
Thank you.
It's my great pleasure to introduce our second speaker. This is Dr. Jonathan Berger. He's going to be talking about architectural acoustics and historically informed performance practices. Dr. Berger is the Dennings Family Provostial Professor at Music at Stanford University and the Director of Stanford's Center for Computer Research in Music and Acoustics. He's an acclaimed composer, researcher, and researcher in music, science, and technology. And I had the great privilege to have Jonathan Berger as my thesis advisor while I was a student at Stanford. So
that was before I needed glasses. Thank you, Elliot. It's great to come right after Chris's talk because I'm also talking about clarity and preferences for reverberation at a very different age. I'm restricting myself to 16th century music, particularly 16th century sacred music. So over the coming 2 days, some of my very favorite people are scholars and scientists are going to share their work on discovering, describing, documenting, and reconstructing human ritual behaviors dating as far back as 40,000 years. The disciplines of paleontology, archaeology, and musicology primarily rely upon tangible material evidence, but here the focus will be on the ephemeral domain of music, of sound. Over the past decade, my students and I have been studying the acoustics of sacred places with two primary foci. First, what is it about sound when experienced in a particular space can evoke a sense of transcendence and awe? Second, when we determine a correspondence between ritual sound and the architecture within the sound, can we determine a correspondence between ritual sound and the architecture within which the sound was created? Later today, we will hear about the evocation of awe from my colleague, Nima Farzana. I originally intended to address the second goal, and time permitting, I will try to touch upon it. But pondering this event, I got distracted thinking about a most basic conundrum in performance practices. And actually, it's incredibly fortuitous that I come following Chris, because I found a quote that has to do exactly with Chris's experiment of stopping the sound in between. And it just made me pause to think about everything I've thought about in the past about performance practices. But you'll have to wait to the end to get there. According to a study by Eitan Ornoy, fewer than 40% of early music performers consider the place in which the original music was played. Experiencing a work in the place for which it was conceived is relatively rare. Even in these rare cases, it's likely that the architecture underwent changes that would affect sound. Last month, I returned to Rome and visited two churches that I spent a lot of time in studying. One, the Chiesa de Gesù, had just reopened after undergoing significant reconstruction. In Catholic churches, modifications were routinely made. New chapels are installed, sculptures are added, sculptures are removed, organs are replaced, cantoria are modified, located, or disappear. It's a constantly evolving architectural space, which causes enormous challenges to people researching these spaces. Each change modifies the acoustics, and of course the presence of a large congregation and adorning tapestries modify the sound. Despite a wealth of writings on performance practices, period writings about the relationship between music and the sound of a specific space are rare and often obscure. However, many of the researchers in this gathering have been remarkably successful at creating good approximations through acoustic modeling. With these models, oralizations can be created that provide insightful clues into the use of sound in ritual. Recreations of architectural acoustics can now be realized in real time, effectively opening up the possibility of integrating architectural acoustics into the domain of historically informed performances. But first, how important is this? Over the centuries since Arnold Dolmetsch started the historically informed performance practice movement, or perhaps cult, a wealth of documentation on articulation, ornamentation, intonation has been discovered. And yet, over the past 75 years, countless recordings of early music were produced with an impressive amount of reverberation. These recordings often comprise sacred as well as secular music whose performance in a church would be inconceivable. But that ancient sound becomes stereotypified. It's not only the fact that people prefer to hear music in reverberant spaces, as Chris said, but there's evolved this culture of an expectation for an ancient sound, for an old sound, which is highly reverberant. It all seems to boil down to a dichotomy between acoustic clarity and blur. Numerous 16th and 17th century descriptions distinguish between reverberant and dry acoustics in music performances. In a letter from about 1600, presumably addressed to Francesco de' Medici, Florentine musician Luigi Zenobi lists the characteristics of a good musician. Among these, he cites the importance that singers take into account differences between singing in a church, in a room, or out of doors. This recognition of the necessity to adapt to the distinct acoustic contrast between church and chamber demands the performer's consideration of acoustic balance in melodic and harmonic intervals, voicing, tempo, and the distance between and placement of singers. And you heard that intuitively done by Chris's cantor going from space to space. The adaptation to space is an intuitive process and one that we need to pay much more attention to. Zenobi specifically states how performance practice is affected by architectural space. A few decades prior to Zenobi's letter, Zarlino similarly alluded to differing performance practices for differing acoustic situations. Within the church, the distinction between intelligibility and richness was often a contentious issue. In the design stage of the Central Jesuit Church in Rome, the Chiesa del Gesù, the issue of desirable acoustics were articulated in documented debates between clergy and patron regarding whether to create a flat or vaulted ceiling. The clergy desiring a flat ceiling to increase intelligibility, Cardinal Farnese desiring an acoustically obscuring dome. The delicate and shifting balances between acoustic clarity and intentional sonic blur reflect divergent tastes, differing priorities, and evolving aesthetic ideals. Here comes the conundrum. Clarity of music and text was a primary concern in the age of Palestrina and beyond. With numerous subsequent treatises on counterpoint leading up to Jeppeson's classic text, which was my teacher, not Jeppesen personally, but that book was my teacher. And here we arrive at the real conundrum. The very essence of Western polyphony is the interaction between musical consonance and dissonance, a controlled interaction. There are a vast number of historical writings on the use of dissonance. Perhaps the most meticulously documented instance is that of the suspension. Stylistically, the suspension becomes an aesthetically pleasing encapsulation of controlled dissonant resolution. Pedagogically, it became central to the study of species counterpoint. However, consider the remarkable disparity between sound that is suspended by reverberation and the implicit clarity demanded in the contrapuntal suspension. When they're sung in churches, that clarity just goes out the window. Berenick's classic text on architectural acoustics discusses the masking effect of reverberation. However, he describes it using simple tones, omitting the role of timbre in the perception of acoustic clarity. More recently, the interaction between timbre and acoustic clarity has been studied, and a dependence, an interdependence has been drawn. So how then can a suspension, the encapsulation of 17th century sacred polyphony, be performed in a reverberant church? And here is an extreme example. A few years ago, I visited the 13th century Cistercian abbey at Fossanova. When I was there, a chorus happened to be performing this work by Palestrina, recorded entirely illegally and unknown. By the degree to which the counterpoint was obscuring. It was as if the acoustic temporal suspension washed across the suspended musical moment, creating a diatonic tone cluster that would likely have made Palestrina nauseous. And yet, Palestrina's music was written to be performed in a wide variety of churches. There's that one moment of the suspension that is literally a complete diatonic cluster. Every note of the scale is audible at the same time. Here's a more local example. This is the Yale Schola Cantorum's recording of Missa Confettibo Tibi Domini, recorded in Christ Church, just down the block at the Yale Green. Here the suspension is heard with far more detail, largely unobscured by the decaying tails. It's a remarkably beautiful recording, and it sort of raises this moment of where is the compromise? If we do a spectrogram of this and look carefully and measure the tails, there again is a wash of sound over it, and yet there seems to me to be absolute clarity of the interaction of voices. This was studied by Yale architect student Davis Butner, and he shared with me some of the reconstructions, the acoustic reconstructions that he did. He did an online exhibit that was remarkably beautifully done of the acoustics of sacred spaces, including this space. So I have no clear explanation why Christ Church on the Green has that much greater clarity. I mean, certainly it's easy to explain why it's more clear than Fossa Nova, but it's not clear to me how to get to that point of recognition of what's the borderline between intelligibility and intentional obscurity in a way that that speaks to the musical intent. Here's a more obscure work by Palestrina, performed by the Stanford Chorale, conducted by my colleague at Stanford, Steve Sano, at Stanford's acoustically problematic Memorial Church. I'm going to play the entire brief work. So the relatively long decay time and the numerous acoustic anomalies resulting from the Memorial Church architecture clearly obscure the details of polyphony. It is almost as bad as the Fossa Nova piece, except for the fact that the suspension in the closing cadence I find remarkably clear in a way that I think can only be explained by the detailed and articulated role of the organ, right? The organ is pointing out notes there. Now, that's the very end. So a few words about this piece. The work is part of a codex that was compiled by Duke Giovanni Angelo Altemps around 1610. Elliot and I spent days in Palazzo Altemps measuring and recording the space, and then we fortuitously found that there was a codex in the library that nobody had really looked at, and we spent the next few years transcribing the music and presenting music for the first time since the 1600s. So the piece by Palestrina, who died about 10 years before the church was built, had this added organ part. Palestrina never wrote for organ in his masses, or he did, but certainly not in the sacred music. So so here's not only a part for organ, but it has a very early example of figured bass. The codex, titled Varia Musica Sacra, comprises part books of a large number of works by many of Rome's most notable composers of the period, compiled by Altemps to be performed specifically in this small church, Chiesa di Sant'Aniceto. Altemps was a polymath. He was knowledgeable in mathematics, astronomy, physics. He was a friend of Galileo. He collected books. He collected musical instruments. He himself wrote music. And he also was completely in charge of the architecture of this small church. He must have intimately known the acoustical properties of the church, and I'm convinced that the sonic qualities of Sant'Aniceto influenced either consciously or subconsciously the composition of many of these works. Many of the works were composed specifically, all the works except for the Palestrina were composed specifically for Sant'Aniceto, and again, many by notable composers. With relatively few architectural modifications since it was consecrated in 1614, Sant'Aniceto suddenly provides a unique opportunity to study the relationship between the architecture and music that was created for it. Here, for example, is an excerpt from Felice Aneria's Misericordia. Aneria was the Kapellmeister, so to speak, of Sant'Aniceto. And this is oralized with the acoustics of Sant'Aniceto. Spectacularly clear acoustics. It has a richness to it, but spectacularly clear. Compare this to the same work oralized in Chiesa del Gesù, which is just, a mile away and constructed approximately at the same time. The amount of decay can make or break contrapuntal integrity. How then should a performer relate to the architecture? One can do nothing and let the reverberation enhance or overwhelm the music, or one can adjust the performance to fit the acoustics. So I conclude with two extreme examples. One is this quote by Peter Phillips, the director of the Tallis Scholars, a completely reputable and wonderful musical group, who prefers to reject historically appropriate acoustics for concert hall clarity. Preferring modern symphony halls where the acoustician has produced a clear and rounded basic sound, he says. So here's someone who is entirely dependent on historically informed reproduction, and yet divorces himself from the acoustics, the original acoustics of where it would be done, in order to get away from the issue of unintelligibility. And here's the quote that I mentioned that relates to Chris's talk. Conversely, Pietro Pontio noted a 16th century practice of singers silencing their voices midway through the notated rhythm. This surprisingly overlooked practice may well have been a performance practice designed to mitigate reverberant oversaturation and preserve clarity. That is my interpretation. I don't know if that's the case. It's never been written about, and in fact, I'm completely surprised as a non-musicologist that this is sort of floated under the radar. So perhaps we need to rethink performance practices in a new, or rather in an old light, thinking about adjusting voices, even fading out of them, in order to preserve integrity and retain richness. So thank you.
Are there any questions?
Hi, I had a question about the mic positions for some of the captures for the recordings. I saw some were for release and some were sort of archiving what was going on. Do you know how they differed? Do they have different approaches?
In the recordings that were in the Palestrina recordings?
Exactly.
Yeah, so the recording at Fossa Nuova I did from the apps. They were sort of near the I did from the nave, and they were near the recording of the Scola Cantorum recording. I don't know. I don't know about mic places, but it was clearly done by someone who was very good at.
Oh yeah, no, they did a nice balance. Yeah, interesting. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you so much for the talk, Jonathan. For the quote of the priest preferring the flat roof at the Chiesa de Gesù, do they talk at all about the height where they would have preferred that to build, or just talked about it being flat?
No. In fact, it was not the. Here's a moment of truth here. It was not the Farnese versus the Jesuit discussion had to do with clarity of oration, right? So they wanted text clarity. They didn't talk about the height. I believe the height had already been established, and it is what it is now. The issue of should there or shouldn't there be a dome didn't, from Farnese's writing, it didn't explicitly say for sonic purposes. He just wanted the grandness and mystery of a dome.
The visual aesthetic,
right.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Have you done any comparison between these marvelous places, the situations that you've done, and, as an example, opera houses? And the reason why I say this, I've been to the Met many times, and people have said, and I've experienced it myself, it's better sometimes, if not always, when you're upstairs in the highest balcony seats that you can imagine, comparing those to when you're paying a lot more money, and forget about the money, it's just the quality of the sound. When you're down in the orchestra
I love this. I love the question. Yeah. So this also relates to Chris's observation of clarity up high. So I have the same experience at the Met. I always go for the top balcony. It has to be the very top. And I agree. It's certainly clearer there. There's a fascinating, legendary story about the aficionados of opera in La Scala, who always sat at the very top, and their criticism of the opera would be by simply which would make or break the life of an opera. But it was known that they were at the very top all the time. Yeah, fascinating.
And it doesn't only happen just with music. Even Balanchine, he said, because of the way his choreography was, you could often, if not always, get a better idea and understanding of the situation and watch the ballets much easier, much better.
Oh, that's really interesting.
From way up at the top, because he did a lot of geometric patterns. And when you're down on the orchestra level, you see it, but it's not the same. When you go up to the top, oh, wow.
Fascinating. Right.
The same is true in my experience of our local Wolsey Hall.
Completely agree. Completely agree with you. Yeah. Having taught 12 years at Yale, and my office was at the very top of Wolsey Hall. I spent a good deal of time up there, and I completely agree that sonically that's the space there. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I'm curious to throw localization into the mix when we talk about intelligibility, especially for Palestrina and maybe some of his earlier forerunners that are writing polyphony with intention in the difference between the different singers and the different elements that they are meant to express. I feel like the concert hall has some affordances, but localization is not necessarily one of them. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are.
Yeah, big topic and big discussion. A couple of things sort of floated at me while I was thinking about these thoughts. One is that Braxton's writings have taught me that in certain cases, the sound reception point was really localized to be for one person, right? To hell with the rest of the congregation. And so that says something about orientation. The other is the idea that in many cases, the singing was not meant to be heard at all, but just by the singers themselves. And so that's a very different capsule of listening.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Please join me in thanking our speaker. Our next speaker is going to be Dr. Janie Cole, who's Assistant Professor of Musicology at the University of Connecticut. Her research areas include musical practices, instruments, and thought in early modern African kingdoms, music, poetry, and spectacle in late Renaissance and early Baroque Italy and France, and music, social change, and prisons in the anti-apartheid struggle in 20th century South Africa. Are you
Thank you very much, Elliot, for that very generous introduction. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. What a marvelous program you've put together. On a small peninsula on the northern side of Lake Tana, in the Amhara region of the northwestern Ethiopian highlands, lie the ruins of the once magnificent, imposing structure of the 17th century single-nave Ethiopian Catholic sacred space of Gorgora Iasus, better known as Gorgora Nova. After centuries of neglect, it collapsed in the summer of 1995, and with only 2 standing sections remaining, the southern tip of the high altar and the lower part of the outer wall. These testify to both the monumental scale of the building and the sophistication of the stonework and design. Gorgora Nova, built in circa 1626 by direct order of the Ethiopian king Susenyos, formed part of a program of new and bold Afro-Eurasian architectural projects developed by Jesuit missionaries in the Christian kingdom of Ethiopia, when from 1624 to 1632, the Ethiopian kingdom briefly became Catholic. These buildings acted as symbols of religious renewal, serving as sacred Catholic spaces of the divine that were underlaid by royal Ethiopian patronage, which shaped these cultural dynamics. Sacred music and sound were also central to the articulation of faith, liturgy, and power. Encountering an ancient Ethiopian Orthodox Tawahedo Christianity dating back to the 4th century and a vibrant royal court culture, European Jesuit missionaries sought a theological mechanism of enculturation, whereby music and ritual sounds created spatial dimensions and reverberant acoustics to activate the architectural oralities of these sacred spaces and to create profound, transcendent spiritual experiences as a primary means of conversion. Drawing on new Jesuit archival documentation and indigenous sources, this paper centers on this key Ethiopian archaeological site of Gorgora Nova, or Gorgora Iasus, as it's also known in the literature, to examine the materialities of the space, its potential for creating acoustical data and a virtual acoustical model, and its sonic manifestations in the form of Jesuit Catholic service, multisensorial ceremonies that combine indigenous Ethiopian and Asian components at the intersections of sacred space, sound, and rite. It addresses the challenges of 3D reconstructions and virtual oralizations in the void, so to speak, when architectural sites such as Gorgora Nova are largely lost. Rather, it proposes a new and innovative solution for a virtual acoustical modeling of this sacred space by combining the incorporation of acoustic data into a spatial model, historical 17th century performance practices and repertories, and interpretative choices that can enable an immersive simulation of its multisensorial experience of the sacred. First, I will examine what we can know about the 17th century structure, materials, textiles, and decorations of Gorgora Nova in terms of its potential acoustics and reverberant sound field of space, to consider the sonic dimensions as a phenomenon linked to other senses, especially in the context of Ethiopian sensory thought and practice. Second, I explore the performativity of the space of Gorgora Nova, which was activated during the liturgy by sonic practices and energy, by reconstructing its soundscape that included Jesuit liturgical practices, polyphony, chant, prayers, recitations, psalms, and masses, combined with local indigenous African instruments and textual settings. This situates the Ethiopian endeavor as part of a Jesuit global mission that comprised significant foreign influences, both in sound and space, as architects, artists, and musicians came from Mughal and Portuguese India and Catholic Europe to produce this highly original sacred space. Lastly, I will propose a solution for a new virtual acoustical modeling of Gorgora Nova, currently a work in progress, which will constitute the first model to ever capture the intangible acoustical heritage of an African heritage site, to show how sound and acoustics shaped local Afro-Eurasian interactions and vice versa within this sacred heritage space on the Northeast African highlands. In building the Catholic faith in Ethiopia, the Jesuit mission adopted and accommodated different aspects of Ethiopian architecture and visual culture in a two-way cultural exchange. It embraced aspects of local Ethiopian art and rites, given its robust tradition of 11 centuries of Ethiopian Orthodox ecclesiastical art and architecture, and an even earlier ancient pre-Christian art and culture, and blended them with the classicizing aesthetics of Counter-Reformation Europe. While European models were undoubtedly used for many constructions, according to Kristen Windmüller-Luna, they were not built without concessions to local liturgical, aesthetic, and financial needs, integrating the design work, building, and project managing of architects, builders, and laborers hailing from Ethiopia, India, Egypt, and elsewhere. In fact, the majority of Jesuit buildings, including churches, palaces, and residences, were built under royal patronage, and by 1625, when work on Gorgora Nova began, a global architectural transformation was underway, with increased royal influence on architecture and the wider use of Ethiopian models and materialities and non-European builders and designers, especially Indian designs and materials. The renowned Spanish architect João Martins began work on the church of Gorgora Nova after 1625 at the site of Cundamba, where King Susenyos had previously established his court, Katama. Martins, who had worked in the houses of São Paulo in Dieu and Bom Jesus in Goa, was one of the most talented architects hailing from Portuguese India and bringing with him the so-called modo goiano or indiano, as Maria Cristina Oswald terms the development of a distinct Indian Jesuit style which exploited local indigenous elements and challenged Jesuit prescriptive features. Defined by Manuel de Almeida as, quote, the phoenix of Ethiopia, the church was meant to recall the major Jesuit prototypes of the Bom Jesus in Goa, São Paulo in Dieu, and Il Gesù in Rome. The design of Gorgora Nova was said to be inspired by São Paulo in Dieu. In fact, it is highly likely that Martins used in Ethiopia his same architectural plans as those used in India for São Paulo, a point I shall come back to. However, no known contemporary architectural plans survive for any of the Jesuit-era buildings on the highlands. Both churches were similar in size, proportions, and design motifs. Completely made of white stone and lime, the church of Gorgora Nova comprised a single nave with a telescopic layout in the main chapel, a coffered barrel vault, and false round windows on the second floor, a feature also applied to the Bom Jesus in Goa. Martinez Dallos Mona has convincingly argued that the Indian stoneworkers taken to Ethiopia and João Martins would have been familiar with the important sacred and secular architecture of northern India, which can be observed in the present-day states of Rajasthan, Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, and Gujarat, in the outstanding Mughal constructions sponsored by Mughal Emperor Akbar in today's northern India and Pakistan. The Indian influences are most apparent in the use of noble materials and elaborate ornamentation in the vaults and arches, with square carved stones with designs of points, foliate motifs, and fleur de lis emerging from floral centers, and in additional friezes, columns, and floral and geometric designs below the vaults, as well as ionic columns and pillars. Ethiopian carpenters also worked at the site, suggesting, as does architectural historian Windmiller Luna, that local African indigenous forms, materials, and designs may also have been used. For example, the coffers, their designs and decorated ceilings may have drawn from Ethiopian architectural designs as found in the Aksumite style structures at the churches of Damo and Yemrechana Christos. The lavish decorations of Gorgora Nova included several carpets and materials imported from the Indian subcontinent. However, scholars identify these differently. According to Windmiller Luna, a missionary source indicates that these included godomejim, from the Spanish aguadameshi, made of molded green and red paper, presumably an imitation of a kind of 15th century Spanish leather wall covering, also used on altar frontals with foliate, animal, and geometric designs stamped in to resemble brocade and decorated with paint and gilding, and also binga. Martinez Dalos Mona rather identifies the material as godorim, from the Indian term gudri, a rich linen from Gujarat embroidered with binga, a variety of the renowned blue spinal gemstone from Sri Lanka. Whichever is the case, the different fabrics, I argue, would have played very different roles in terms of their sound absorption properties and relations to the acoustical space. King Susenyos gave a sizable donation for the church ornaments, including pieces of silver. This comes from the archival record, possibly to be made by skilled Ethiopian metalworkers, and Gaba Krestos gave 2 large rugs for the altar steps. Other imported objects included images of St. Ignatius of Loyola and the Virgin, and in addition to icons and paintings, other objects used in the mission churches were ostiarios, chalices, rosaries, crowns of the Holy Virgin, tin crosses, chaplets, and small reliquaries, and other church paraphernalia that intended to give visitors a sense of the magnificence of Catholicism, as well as being used for the Roman ritual. Craig Wright has shown a direct relationship between the disposition of the liturgical furnishings of the choir enclosure at the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris in the early Renaissance, for example, with sound-absorbing decorations such as textiles, paintings, hung for the importance of the feast being celebrated, and as a result, the harmonic sophistication of the music performed. The less reverberant the space due to the absorptive properties of the textiles and paintings hung, the greater probability that complex contrapuntal music could have been performed. So far, the architectural and archival records on Gorgora Nova have yielded only this fragmentary information regarding the types of decorative materials used that could potentially have served as sound-absorbent material and the placings of the choir stalls. These decorations and furnishings would have, of course, affected the musical acoustics of the sacred space, which was as much an instrument as the voices of the sacred rite itself. Jesuit Catholic service was a multisensory experience in liturgy, which included polyphony, prayers, recitations, chants, psalms, and masses. As Andrew Talon defines, in acoustical terms, the primary product of the combination of this sacred music and architecture is reverberation. He says, quote, "It is the sum of countless indistinguishable echoes that are produced as sonic impulses are reflected with varying degrees of absorption from the walls, decorations, and furniture in a combination that is unique to every building," unquote. While we know something of the early modern musical Jesuit repertory performed in Gorgora Nova, a point I shall return to, we know much less about how it was performed, because practice was by nature intuitive and improvisatory, and thus intended not to be recorded and noted